Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
But I'm trying to find common ground, and I say, when you say God's kingdom, what do you think about? And they say, oh, well, justice and these things. And I was like, me too. I think that's important too. Let's join together and do that. You, because partially you're scared of burning in hell for all eternity. Me, just because I think it's a great idea. But let's do it.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today, settle in, because you're going to hear a fascinating conversation. This is one of those talks that took place at Q that people are still talking about today because it was deep and because it was a conversation between two friends, two fascinating people. Either one of them could have been the subject of just an interview focused on them, but when you hear them having a conversation about spirituality, about the world that we live in, about how we think about that, I think it will fascinate you too. Now, here's the two people. Here's the two subjects. One is Dave Bazan. Now, Dave Bazan, some of you maybe have heard of the indie band Pedro the Lion. This was a group that he was a part of, the songwriter, the driving force behind that. Rapid success in the culture. I mean, this was a band that people appreciated. They loved them. They were one of those first kind of indie format bands that just took the world by storm, and tons of people jumped on, selling hundreds of thousands of albums. But then he's sitting with his friend, a guy named David Dark, who I consider David just a great philosopher. He's somebody who's written so many good books about pop culture, about faith, about how do we think about this idea of American life and culture, and also truth that starts to spring forward in it. So follow me here. I think when we look at the culture around, we see truth. I mean, Chuck Colson early on was one of the great influences in my life. And I remember first understanding this idea of common grace that he described. And the idea of common grace was essentially the grace that God gives to all of us and all of creation, whether you follow Jesus or not. But common grace kind of holds back the elements of the fall or sin or brokenness that would otherwise overwhelm creation. And so you see grace come out in works of beauty and art and architecture and science and music and all these beautiful spaces. And you say, well, how did that happen? Because the person who created that art, maybe they don't say that they're a Christian or they're not a Christian, but yet what they created was beautiful. Well, you would categorize that as the common grace that all human beings have because they're made in the image of God. Now, follow me to this next step. So then, as we're listening to music, as we're looking at film, as we're looking at art, as we're appreciating the world around us, this good world that we at Q say we need to all stay curious about, we need to enjoy this good world. When we see those things come out, do we have the discernment to see through them? Do we see truth coming out? Do we see people who otherwise would never subscribe to Christianity, but yet laying out these amazing Christian ideas and principles and words of Jesus that are truth, and so that truth goes forward? Well, this conversation is going to be an exercise in that. You're going to get to sort of challenge yourself to say, can I see that in this conversation? Can I understand how a philosopher, David Dark, is having a conversation with Dave Bazan, this artist who expresses a lot of truth in the music that he writes, even if he wouldn't say any of that has this Christian underpinning? David Dark's able to see some of that through it. And so he's going to help you see through that lens. Now, I don't often just read bios, but I wanted to read David Dark's bio because I think you'll appreciate just this unique man that's conducting this interview, and I want you to appreciate him because he's truly one of the most unique people I've ever met. He's the author of a book called Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. So think about that for a second. Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. The Sacredness of Questioning Everything, another book that he wrote, which I love because Q's all about questions, and he's talking about the value of questions. But then he wrote this great book called Everyday Apocalypse, subtitle, The Sacred Revealed in Radiohead, The Simpsons, and Other Pop Culture Icons. And then he wrote a book called The Gospel According to America, a meditation on a God-blessed, Christ-haunted idea. So his works appeared in MTV News, Books and Culture, Pitchfork, The Oxford American, and he's also doing something fascinating right now. He teaches at the Tennessee Prison for Women, and he also teaches at Belmont University, where he is assistant professor of religion and the arts in the College of Theology. So now you know who's going to be in this conversation. Think through that lens I just described. How can you start to see common grace playing out in the music you're listening to, in the pop culture experiences that you have, in the musicals maybe that you attend, maybe in the books and fiction writing that you're reading? Wherever it is, how can we have that kind of lens to see that and just sit back and enjoy a wonderful conversation that we titled Unsettling Questions?
Dave first appeared within the public mind, perhaps, under the moniker / brand of Pedro the Lion. And then an exceptional, well, there was a moment when you were operating under Paperback, and I still have a Paperback t-shirt. But after Paperback, another one called Headphones, but now just Dave Bazan. And Curse Your Branches is the most recent one, and Hard to Be came off of Curse Your Branches. And the latest, Strange Negotiations.
Yep.
And it's on NPR, what do you call it?
Oh yeah, there's a song on All Songs Considered. Wolves at the Door, yeah.
Okay, Wolves at the Door. Earlier today, okay, well, we'll maybe have time to look at both songs, but thinking of Hard to Be, and maybe, who's heard Curse Your Branches? If you raise your hand if you're familiar with this work. Okay, there's some people. Something that was said earlier today brought to mind some of the process of Curse Your Branches, so I'm going to mention that and then invite you to talk about the process. It was mentioned earlier today by Kevin Kelly that the proper response to a bad idea is a better idea. That when somebody has a bad idea, and I'm thinking here primarily a bad idea about God, bad God view, bad God concept, that our response shouldn't be stop thinking, but should be think more, better ideas. And that brought to mind, and I think this speaks to the music and the function of a story and song, something Fred Friendly said. Fred Friendly was Edward R. Murrow's right-hand guy, played by George Clooney in Good Night and Good Luck. Yep. And Fred Friendly famously said that the job of a newsman, but we could say news person, minstrel, storyteller, artist, is to create a pain in the viewer, listener, audience's mind that can only be relieved by thinking, by imagining the world differently.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about Curse Your Branches, and you can go back as far as you want, but the process of Curse Your Branches as these songs, Hard to Be being the first song on the album, emerged.
Well, it felt at times like I was, we were talking about earlier today how I think that the history of my growing up in evangelical Christianity was a series of imaginings of the character of God. That at some point early on, somebody said, "This is what God is like. Can you imagine that?" And I responded, "Yes, I can." I was 3 or whatever, however old I was. And over the course of my church experience, it was always a revised, like reimagining of, somebody would say, "Have you been thinking of God in this way?" And we would all go, "Yeah." And they go, "That's the wrong way to think about God. You need to start thinking about God in this way." And so by the time I was 22 or 23, I was pretty satisfied that I was imagining the best God possible. And his name was Jehovah or whatever. And then later in my 20s, I started to think really hard about some of the assumptions that I had made about that character in my best imagining of him, and realized that I didn't like him at all. Thought he was an asshole and not as powerful as or interested or something. It was difficult to quantify, and so I just went back and
not as humanly committed, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite as interested in these, what appeared to be mostly objects of wrath,
right?
In the language of Romans 9, and that wasn't cool with me. And so I decided to. I didn't decide anything. I just started writing songs as I do, and then all of these things started coming out, and I realized, oh man, like I'm taking on, capital God D. And then by the time I got through with the record, I realized, no, I'm just, that's the myth of a powerful movement like American evangelical Christianity, that there is one way to think about a thing, that the interpretation that is universal, that seems universal, is the real thing. And so in the end, I realized that I was making a record that was kind of challenging nothing more than an institution, and then got in a lot of trouble for that. So.
Yes.
Institutions don't like to be challenged.
Yes. You've complimented me by saying that I have a generous, that I maybe believe things into existence. I don't want to say positive spin, but read.
Well, it's not spin. It's goodwill, and it's
yes.
Yeah, it's not.
Well, I know that in our conversation, in our back and forth, and Dave and I are very close and have lots of conversations about these things. Fairly recently, way back, I quoted Leonard Cohen. I quoted Leonard Cohen to you. I think it's in Democracy is Coming to the USA. He says, and he's trying to be funny, but he's also speaking descriptively in a way. He says, "I'm the little Jew who wrote the Bible." And to that, it seemed to me that Cohen is observing, noting that he himself is part of a continuum, part of a tradition of crying out loud, of questioning, of complaining, a kind of back and forth dialectic of, you've heard it said, but I say unto you, once this, now this. I offered that to you as a kind of, I noted, especially with Curse Your Branches, many of those songs, that it seemed to me that the more you shake your fist at bad conceptions of God, the more biblical you're being. Because as I read it, the Bible is, and this is a Eugene Peterson line, is relentlessly narratival, relentlessly lyrical, always pushing further toward fresher interpretations of the living word, kind of thing. And, long way around, biblical imagination is a phrase that probably, I guess a couple of weeks ago when you were in Nashville, I dropped that one your way, and you responded somewhat surprisingly favorably to it, to my mind. Could you talk about that?
Well, in the beginning of that very controversial little book, Love Wins, Eugene Peterson, in praise of the book, talks about it being in the tradition of a deeply biblical imagination. And it dawned on me that my imagination was, for the only time, the times that I exercised it most growing up until I was 25, was in a biblical context, that turn the other cheek, love your enemy, that these things required great imagination. And these were the tasks that I used my imagination for most often growing up. And if my imagination is functional, it's because I spent so much time chewing on these ideas, these biblical notions, as distorted as they may or may not have been in my upbringing. But and so that notion of biblical imagination, that's what this is all about, that we're trying to imagine a way forward in the context of this tradition that we reluctantly or not reluctantly are participating in.
And by mentioning the Sermon on the Mount, you seem to imply that you feel a kind of pinch or call or summons, an ethical summons, if you like, to a kind of faithfulness to the ethic, the politics exemplified by Jesus of Nazareth. Could you describe that pinch or summons, call, however you want to put that?
I find myself participating with evangelical Christians, even though I myself am, I guess, a non-practicing evangelical.
I think if more, for modesty's sake, it might be a good idea. And if we let evangelical be transpartisan good news bringer or multi-partisan good news bringer, I think evangelical and Christian should probably be a public verdict,
not a self-description,
rather than a self-description. And I always like pointing out because I'm obsessive this way, that they were first called Christians in Antioch.
Yeah.
So, sorry to interrupt.
Well, and that brings up an excellent point that Gillian Welch says over and over in a song, that time is the revelator. Yeah. That people are very fond of proclaiming the category that they would like themselves to be in, or confess what they allegedly believe, but time is in fact the revelator.
Time will demonstrate. The proof is in the pudding.
Yeah.
With that, something that I write down things that you say all the time. You talk about reserving judgment on your own identity,
Yeah.
which I think relates to this, and the danger when we start insisting on beliefs that we claim to have, preceding any public discernment of a particular practice, we end up being people who are committed to nothing much more than the rigorous defense of our own personalities.
Yeah.
Could you say something about that, or?
Well, that's just the crux of all of this. I think that who are we? What are our I forgot her name, but the gal that spoke right before this spoke to that sort of our hidden subconscious motivations. That what is it that we're after, and who are we trying to manipulate to get there? And how could anybody in the room possibly consider themselves a part of a redemptive religious tradition, given that those things are just completely unchecked? That's what drives us, is we wake up and we're trying to do this and that and the other thing, and then there's just a maybe through contemplative prayer or smoking weed or whatever it is that people are doing to try to take stock of things, that they would sit and take stock. And there's a wake of destruction that we're all leaving, and to take stock of that, and to try to let that stop us in our tracks the way that it ought to. People say, so how's it going? Are you being successful and stuff? And it's like, I don't know, I kind of got stuck here because I'm a bastard, and I have to kind of own up to that with my wife and my family and all these things. So I've been busy taking seriously my social contracts that I have outstanding that I didn't really think about before. And so it's this thing of like, that's the opposite of defending your personality. Somebody says, you're a bastard. And it's just like, yeah, do you still want to hang out a little bit? Like, is there, I agree.
Yes. There's a self-emptying thing going on. And when I say self-emptying, and an hour ago we were talking about this, the Philippians passage, in which, actually an old hymn, Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant slave. That self-emptying seems very in keeping, and it can be linked up with the tradition of negative theology, in which Meister Eckhart, for instance, says, God, rid me of God. Yeah. The prayer, very related to this, deliver me from these crazy conceptions that are death-dealing in the way they make me look at people. Did you have something you wanted to throw in there?
Well, I think this all started, you were asking about the Sermon on the Mount and whatever, and I find myself interacting with people that we have different worldviews, but I'm trying to find common ground, and I say, when you say God's kingdom, what do you think about it? And they say, oh, well, justice and these things, and I was like, me too. I think that's important too. Let's join together and do that. You, because partially you're scared of burning in hell for all eternity, me just because I think it's a great idea, but let's do it. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And that there can be, and that time is the revelator, the proof's in the pudding, the fruit on the tree. That's the thing. Yeah. People can claim all kinds of things, but what's the fruit? In the end.
Another Leonard Cohen line that relates to the idea of Christianity, the verdict of Christianity. Someone described Cohen as a poet, and he said, well, thank you, but poetry isn't a choice, it's a verdict.
Right.
And poetry as a term of affirmation, which, like Christian, we should maybe be careful about self-applying, but poetry is the news that stays news. The classic is that which never stops saying what it has to say. And the idea of the prophetic. I think it was Allen Ginsberg who said, somebody asked Allen Ginsberg, how do you become a prophet? And he said, tell your secrets. Yeah. As if it's just as simple as that.
And you give up so much by doing that. You give up credibility with people. But give up credibility today because it's the way forward. You're not credible. You're full of contradictions. You must admit
everybody
it
needs
now.
to write that down. Give up credibility.
It's the
today.
only
Yes.
way forward because it's power. We're all trying to
Right.
get power over other people, and that's all your credibility is when you say something, you want people to listen. I know you think I'm weird sitting here. Like this is fine with me. Credibility is it's you trying to have power over other people. And if you believe in what Jesus said, which I almost do, you can't be trying to collect power over other people. It's not what he was trying to have you do.
Okay, well, I just want to read that Cormac McCarthy quote
Yeah.
anyway. Okay,
Oh my
witness, an operative term that Dave and I often bandy about, a very helpful term, witness, because I don't think we can ever speak of our witness as something that we are now about to bring to our 9 to 5, or a witness as something that I have yet to apply to certain relationships. Too late.
You've already done it.
You've already done it. Your witness, show me your receipts, a transcript of everything you've texted, all of your emails, everything you've said in one day, your gas mileage, I'll show you your witness. As that, I'm trying to be funny as well. I don't mean to be overly provocative. But your witness is what you do.
Yeah, your witness is.
Your witness is your stand.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I hope it's been fascinating for you to listen in and follow along. It was certainly deep, intense, great thoughts, and just appreciate conversation. Appreciate friendship that you saw in this conversation between two people who are able to have these very open conversations about spirituality, about faith, about culture, about the kind of things we create, how we label things, how we should think about the church, what is the opportunity for faithfulness in Christians, and to understand new generations and how they're thinking about things. It was just challenging, and I think, if anything, the medium of just conversation was demonstrated so well today. Like I said, David Dark's book, The Sacredness of Questioning Everything, says a lot. It says a lot about Q, the way we approach things. We say, look, let's talk about any subject, and we can talk to anybody, because we don't have a fear of these other ideas inculcating themselves into what is true, but we think when we hear other people's ideas, we actually have an opportunity to see what is true about them and to challenge them and to have debate and conversation and to learn together. We also think there should be great humility in how we approach other people and their ideas, and it's only in that humility that we can continue to learn, continue to grow, continue to question things, or even strengthen the way in which our views are shored up, because we start to understand, man, these really are valid. I can have confidence in this. And so as you continue throughout your week, we look forward to continuing more talks, more conversations in the days ahead, and I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of Q Ideas.